Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Are you thirsty for a Canada Water Agency? It's being put on by the Manitoba Eco Network and FLOW, the Forum for Leadership on Water. And today we'll be hearing from speakers from FLOW, from the Centre for Indigenous Environmental Resources, CIER, and the Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective. They'll be sharing some of their thoughts on how to get engaged in the upcoming consultations by Environment and Climate Change Canada on the creation of a Canada Water Agency. My name is Vicki Burns, and I'll be the MC for today's event. I've recently assumed the position of Chair of the Manitoba Eco Network Board, and I'm very pleased to be with you today to learn more about this really important issue. My interest in water issues stems from the past 13 years that I've been working on promoting awareness and action around Lake Winnipeg's blue-green algae blooms. So the concept of creating a national agency to develop policies that will aid in ensuring clean, safe water across Canada for now and the future is really appealing to me, and I'm guessing it is to all of you as well. Today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The water we drink comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, and the hydropower we enjoy comes at the expense of many First Nations in northern and rural Manitoba. We're connected through the inherent responsibility to respect the water bodies, tributaries, and spirit of the Lake Winnipeg watershed. Our organizations are committed to systemic change, to respect treaties and all the Indigenous nations, and to real reconciliation. Those of you who are participating may want to acknowledge the Indigenous territories that you're joining from, either just to yourselves or by putting it in the chat box. Now today we're going to be hearing from 3 speakers who will each talk for about 12 minutes. And following the 3 speakers, we'll have a question and answer period. So if you've got questions, please type them in the chat box, and our admin support team, Calvin and Emily, will collate them, and I'll then present them to our speakers. The event is also being live streamed on the Manitoba Eco Network Facebook page. So now, without further me talking, I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Richard Farthing-Nicol. And Richard is the director for the Forum for Leadership on Water, FLOW, and he's also a project manager for CIER. He has experience in the nonprofit, consulting, and public service roles with a focus on watershed governance, policy work, and data analysis. So please go ahead, Richard.
Okay, thanks, Vicki, and welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us today. I'll just share my screen. I got a few slides. Can I get a thumbs up? You can all see that? Yeah, okay, right on. Okay, so yeah, my name is Richard. I'm the director of FLOW, and I'm going to be providing a pretty high level introductory look at the Canada Water Agency. So where it came from, what FLOW's perspective is on what we think it should be, and where it might be going. So first, a bit of background on FLOW. So we're a nonpartisan organization of individuals from across the country and a lot of folks who have a lot of experience and expertise in water law and policy. And so that's our focus. And over the past year and a half, we've been really engaged on the Canada Water Agency question. And so if you go to our website, you can find quite a bit of commentary and analysis on the agency. We've also been engaging with government and trying to convene other interested organizations across the country to talk about the agency and to talk about what our aspirations are for what it could accomplish. So first I'll start just with a few high-level points about why do we need a Canada Water Agency? And I think there's many reasons we do. These are 4 key ones though. So one is that as we all know, climate change is exacerbating existing water challenges and creating a lot of really new and deeply complex challenges around water management, water quality, as well as scarcity and other issues. And there needs to be a really focused, integrated approach to climate resiliency and adaptation. Related to that, we have an exponential increase in water-based natural disasters, so floods and droughts primarily. And we've seen a big spike over the past 20 years in the economic toll that takes as well in terms of cost of recovery. Third, really importantly, and this is a pretty gross understatement, but Indigenous water rights are inadequately recognized in current water management systems. Canada Water Agency alone can't solve this. We really need a whole of government transformative approach to the way we do government to government, nation to nation relationships between the Crown and Indigenous nations. But as far as water rights go, a new federal agency could help focus on this challenge and this opportunity. And the last one there is a really cross-cutting issue, is that there's fragmented water governance across the country. This is both within the federal government. There's over 20 departments within the federal government that have some responsibility for freshwater management. It's also between different levels of government. So federal, provincial, and Indigenous, territorial, municipal governments all have some responsibilities for freshwater management. And we really need to see better coordination amongst those different levels of government. And so what is the Canada Water Agency? Right now, it's nothing. It's 3 words on a piece of paper. It's a government commitment, but it doesn't actually exist yet. So where it came from initially in those words was the Liberal Party platform in the 2019 federal election. So some high level language about committing to establishing a Canada Water Agency for better managing our freshwaters. And since then, it's been a consistent focus of government, but it hasn't been concretely established yet. So we saw in the 2019 mandate letters, the Environment Minister and the Agricultural Minister, with the support of Winnipeg MP Terry Duguid, Parliamentary Secretary, were mandated with making the agency happen and operationalizing that platform commitment. Since then, we've seen some groundwork. So Environment Canada did some consultation last year, some online consultation, did some kind of internal research and looking at what the agency could be and what it could cover. Importantly, we saw the federal government last fall recommit to the Canada Water Agency in their throne speech. But the most substantive piece so far is what's happening right now, which is these public consultations. And so the feds released their discussion paper on the agency late last year. And now there's a series of national and freshwater forums, including the Prairie Forum next week, that's looking for public input on what the agency could look like. So it's really gearing up, and we're expecting to see something established this year, hopefully. So what's important to know about the agency? One is that it's a really important commitment. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all water management and governance challenges, but it is one of the most important federal freshwater policy developments to happen in years. Folks who have a lot more experience than I do in the field say it's the most important thing to happen in decades. So there's a lot of potential behind this one. It's important to know that it's currently undefined. So as Environment Canada has said in their consultations, there's been no final decisions made yet. So it really is kind of up in the air as to what it'll look like. It's important to know that it has a freshwater focus, so marine issues are explicitly out of scope for the agency, at least for the time being. And an interesting one is that the government has made various comments about the agency being closely linked to agriculture and water management in an agricultural landscape. The agency was actually, during the 2019 election, was one of the main things being championed by then Saskatchewan MP Ralph Goodale. So it's got very close links to the prairies and to agriculture. It's not clear what those are going to look like yet and how that's going to manifest itself in the final product, but something to watch. So what's Flow's take, my organization? So since day one, we've been saying really 4 key priorities of what we think an agency could do. So there's a lot of work to be done around creating and mobilizing knowledge. Important to point out, there's a lot of great work being done on the ground already. In Manitoba, we have community-based water monitoring programs through Lake Winnipeg Foundation, Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective, and there's similar efforts across the country. So supporting those community-based water monitoring efforts is really important, but also just acting as a hub for water information and data and disseminating that to decision makers and others across the country who need it. Second, this focus on transboundary water management. So as we know, water doesn't respect the jurisdictional boundaries that we throw up, and it flows across provinces, Indigenous jurisdictions, through cities. And so just a focus on dispute resolution and avoidance when it comes to water challenges, and also just providing national scale leadership on water issues. Third, as I was talking about earlier, strengthening and advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. This would look different, you can imagine, across the country, depending on the Indigenous nation and their needs and values. But what we've been advocating, without being prescriptive about it, is ensuring consistency with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which government has committed to, but we really want to see operationalized, especially in the context of water. And from the outset, in developing the agency and the operations of the agency, ensuring that it's run according to a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship with Indigenous peoples. The fourth point is collaborative river basin planning. So going back to the idea that, as we know, water flows across jurisdictional boundaries and is much more effectively governed according to river basins and watersheds. So really mainstreaming that paradigm shift into water management and governance across the country. One way you could do that is through basin-wide governance agreements between different levels of government. And we think the agency could play a key role there. And then the last really overarching point to all of this is that we think the Canada Water Agency is a great first step and has a lot of potential, but it can't be the end game. It has to be seen as a stepping stone, because there's a lot of other things that need to happen from a federal standpoint, like renewing outdated legislation like the Canada Water Act, which dates from 1970, renewing the federal water policy, which dates from 1987, and other legislative and policy priorities that also need to happen. And the agency can help enable those things and help lead that work, but we can't stop with the agency. I don't think I have too much time left for this. I kind of lost track of the clock here, but this is just something I'll put out there, and maybe if folks are interested, they could look up this project. But there was a project proposed and kind of actually green lighted by the provincial government in Saskatchewan, a $4 billion irrigation project that's going to have downstream impacts for Manitoba that has had a complete absence of Indigenous consent or engagement so far, and has a lot of unanswered questions about the impacts of climate change. And this is just something I think is a really good example of something that needs further study, that needs that interjurisdictional transboundary governance piece that the Canada Water Agency could play a key role in. And without, I don't have the expertise to have a definitive opinion on this project, but I think it's pretty clear that it's very complex. It's an enormous project with downstream impacts, and we need a federal agency to help provide that expertise and that coordination capacity. And that's all I have. So that's just the introductory piece, and I'll pass it off to my colleagues for some more in-depth content stuff. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Those are really important points, and you've got us off to a good start. I just want to remind everybody that if you have questions that you want answered, please put them in the chat box, and our admin support people will collate them and we'll ask them at the end. Now, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Cheyenne McKay. Cheyenne is a senior project manager for the Centre for Indigenous Environmental Resources, CIER, which is Canada's only Indigenous-directed environmental nonprofit charitable organization. She's of Ojibwe descent, a member of Pine Creek First Nation, and currently resides in the Treaty 2 territory in Brandon. And Cheyenne has 14 years experience in the environmental conservation sciences field, with 13 years working directly with First Nation communities. So welcome, Cheyenne, and please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. It's not letting me get the view. Sorry, can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Richard, for that great introduction to the Canada Water Agency and how it came to be. And I would like to just provide a little bit more introduction that I am a senior project manager with SEER, and also I have been with the organization for 11 years. It'll be 12 years in September this year. And I'm here to talk about, to put an Indigenous lens on this and to talk about what opportunities exist for Indigenous governments as we explore how to become more engaged with the Canada Water Agency. So I'll go into a little bit of an introduction for my organization, the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific pieces of UNDRIP and the TRC calls to action that can support involvement with the Canada Water Agency, and a few more Indigenous perspectives on the water agency itself. So as mentioned by Vicky, SEER is Canada's first national Indigenous directed environmental nonprofit charitable organization. It was founded in 1994 by a group of chiefs across Canada that decided that there needed to be more supports available for Indigenous communities in Canada that can act on behalf of the communities and work in between the different government and private organizations, foundations that exist to help support the organizations with their environmental pursuits. SEER has worked on 450 projects with over 300 Indigenous nations across Canada. We have two main focus areas, which are protecting lands and waters and building sustainable communities. So when we talk about Indigenous water rights, we can't have a secure future without addressing our water rights and the outstanding entitlements of Indigenous nations. So we can't force Indigenous peoples to litigate these because we're delaying the inevitable, that it's not a really good approach to take. We need to get serious about water security in Canada, and Indigenous governments have a pivotal role in this process. Some of the different documents and bodies out there that can support this is, I'm just changing my view here, sorry, UNDRIP and specific articles within UNDRIP. The Indigenous peoples must be involved in the creation of institutions that impact them, and that's from Article 19. Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights, Article 18. And from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calls to action 45 to 47 call for a restructuring of legal governance and institutional structures in Canada. So it's calling the different governments to step up and collaborate and co-develop with Indigenous governments in order to make impactful change. So what are the implications for the Canada Water Agency? It gives us an opportunity to build new institutions together, not just having an institution built and then bringing in the Indigenous governments after the fact. It's an opportunity to have collaborative effort in the 5 water jurisdictions, and those are Indigenous, federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal, who must then participate or have the choice to participate in its governance structure and decision-making processes. And Canada has a real opportunity here to lead the way by creating the Canada Water Agency structure and providing sufficient funding for it. But the CWA itself must be developed and implemented collaboratively, which is a really important point. So in terms of co-development, you could provide a new approach to water governance with the Indigenous nations that recognize multiple knowledge streams, including incorporating Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ecological knowledge. And it would be a reconciliation-based, consent-honoring approach to avoiding conflict and building collaboration over the long term, but also allows for the expression of Indigenous jurisdiction. So the nations would bring their water jurisdictions to a collaborative table to work with other jurisdictions to achieve common water outcomes. It wouldn't be that the jurisdiction would already be established and the community would be coming in to work under that umbrella. So participation of Indigenous nations, you may think that it's not recognizing the validity of the federal government's laws on their lands. We can't think of it like that we're coming into something that's already established, but it's an acknowledgement that the health of the waters flowing through the Indigenous lands are inevitably impacted by the Canadian laws, and Indigenous peoples play a role in defining these laws. And especially for communities that fall under the First Nations Land Management Act, they have a real opportunity to develop their own land code and develop their own environmental laws that can take place in these type of agreements within the Canada Water Agency. So it's really important that the Indigenous governments have an opportunity here to exercise their water jurisdiction, and the government needs to understand and create that opportunity for the communities and the Indigenous governments to give them a space and a safe cultural space to do that. And it creates more water governance reform. And the Canada Water Agency, it has an opportunity to lead the way to do this. And this is just an example of the type of structure that we can use. And it's from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. I'm not sure if many people are aware, but the Institute was created earlier this year, and it aims to establish a strong foundation for decision-making by producing sound research in climate and climate policy that's evidence-based, engaging with experts, business leaders, policymakers, thought leaders, and the wider Canadian public to convene constructive discussions about the choices and trade-offs ahead. But it's also sharing the evidence and the case studies and solutions, and they put out a lot of reports. And these reports, they can really shape climate policy in Canada by providing the information to Environment Climate Change Canada, and then it reaches the federal level that can really impact change. What I like about the Climate Choices is that they have Indigenous representation on their board, expert panels, advisory panels, and they also have a senior advisor of Indigenous engagement embedded right within the staff. And I provided a website link here in publications, and I'm also one of the advisory panel members. So I've been really integrated into this organization and helping support getting the Indigenous voices heard, especially from Indigenous researchers. So I think having a structure like this for the Canada Water Agency, having Indigenous people involved at all levels would be a really strong way forward in terms of co-development. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cheyenne. That's really important points that you're making for sure. Now we'll go to our third speaker, Daniel Gladu-Canoe. Daniel is the director of the Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective, LWIC, the Indigenous voice for Lake Winnipeg, that protects and preserves the lands and waters of our nations to restoring the health of the sacred lake for future generations. Daniel is of Anishinaabe, Irish, and Métis descent from Treaty 3 territory in eastern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. So please go ahead, Daniel. And just before you do, I just want to remind people that if you've got questions, please put them in the chat, and our admin people will collate them. So Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Vicki. Yeah, and actually, thank you to Cheyenne and Richard too for your for sharing with us, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak alongside you. And I guess thank you too for everyone who's come to attend and listen to hopefully some words of wisdom from the three of us. I will also share my screen. And I guess for, well, you know, if you're anything like me, when you see people rally around water and the idea of protecting it and getting some, you know, action on protecting water, that's exciting. I've certainly appreciated a lot of the excitement that's happened over this past year and since 2019 around water, around discussions with in regards to the Canada Water Agency. And it really had me thinking about like, well, what is it that, what would I contribute, or what's something that would be good to see for Lake Winnipeg? And after some thinking, and with a partner at the Lake Winnipeg Foundation, what occurred to us is that there's still a lot of important work that is ongoing with the federal government, things, commitments, laws, policies, all of which really still need follow through and I guess action, as it were. So part of what we drafted as a result was the 5 things the federal government must do for Lake Winnipeg. And we really centered that around just actions that we saw could happen, both when, that could be done by the Canada Water Agency, but also by federal departments as they have those responsibilities now. Another thing, though, we noticed that with a lot of the talk around the Canada Water Agency was that there was a lot of ideas, a lot of new ideas coming out, some old ideas too, sorry. And I worry that folks see that the agency is something of a magic bullet, that it will sort of wave away the problems that we're experiencing. And I think a lot of the challenges we have around water aren't something that can be done simply by a change in process, or there's some hard work to do, right? And I think Cheyenne talked about a relationship with Indigenous people. That is not something that changes quickly, and the work that's being done, has been done for some time and is ongoing, is still is slow, right? And it's going to be hard and a long slog. So I did want to temper a little bit some of that excitement, is what I was starting to see, right? And that we should look at what's possible for the federal government and for a Canada Water Agency. The other thing I thought I mentioned, and Richard talked about this too, with the sort of agricultural priorities that pop up from time to time. And there's a lot of federal governments who have responsibilities to water. And I think that it's important to draw a distinction between what is water use and water for a purpose that helps humans and people and economies and jobs and those types of things, and then water that's protected and protected for itself, for the value it brings to the world around it, and for life. And I think that federal government naturally has those two responsibilities in different ways in different departments. So, the agriculture department has a strong emphasis on making sure that there's enough water for farms. And I think that that's one thing that they would bring to the agency naturally. Environment Canada is about protecting water for its quality. Fisheries look at how the water is used for fish and those types of things. And I think that a lot of bringing those priorities together, it's not clear to me where we'll end up with an agency. How will it direct where we go with water issues? I still think some of those old challenges about, is this water meant for people and our use, or does it have its own value that deserves protection? That said, we did notice there's a lot of good things that the federal government could be doing. So let me draw. So some of the 5 things that we looked at were recognizing phosphorus. So for Lake Winnipeg, right now there's a debate around which nutrients are contributing to algal blooms in Lake Winnipeg. And we really wanted to emphasize that debate itself has been quite harmful to the lake, and is preventing us from actually taking actions on reducing phosphorus and reducing algal blooms. And this has effects across multiple jurisdictions, of course. So we see that it's important that the federal government provides some leadership there. They've done so in the case of Lake Erie, and it seems surprising to me, and I think to a lot of others, that hasn't been emphasized here for Lake Winnipeg. Similarly, looking at evidence to make decisions around Lake Winnipeg. And I think a lot of this could be true for other watersheds, of course. But if you think of Lake Winnipeg, we have a number of programs, funding programs and research work that's being done. And that we think it's important to put accountability measures there to make sure that those programs are run for the purposes that they set out to, say, reducing phosphorus or something like that. There's a lot of points under supporting Indigenous peoples that can be raised. As I mentioned before, this work is hard work and long work, but it has to start. It has to start today, or certainly should have started yesterday. And now we're looking at the need to get United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples should be recognized and informing the federal government's approach. But there's also a lot of questions around how Indigenous knowledge is acknowledged, recognized, and responded to. And in the case of Lake Winnipeg, we have a State of the Lake report that really has very little to no recognition of Indigenous knowledge. And I think that that's work that could start with, with being led by Indigenous knowledge holders. We're talking about increasing enforcement, of course. And I think that there's a lot of laws in Canada protecting water and the environment, but those laws are only as good as the enforcement of those laws. And so I really would look to federal government to make sure that that kind of enforcement would be happening. And unfortunately, we do see signs that it doesn't, that policies put in place, regulation and laws all put in place that don't always get the follow through and the resources they need to actually have an effect on the ground. We point to the Fisheries Act, to invasive species crossing our borders, and to wetlands being drained. Wetlands being drained across the prairies. We look at least half of the historical wetlands have been drained, maybe as much as 70%. And that's something that's happened even with policies by the federal government that have said that that shouldn't happen. And then finally, fulfilling jurisdictional responsibilities. We look really to some good action planning around Lake Winnipeg, that we should have not only targets for what we're doing in Lake Winnipeg, but also how we're going to do it. That should be laid out. We see those kinds of plans exist for Lake Erie in the Great Lakes, and it would only be appropriate to apply that here to Lake Winnipeg. And related to that, there's a memorandum of understanding between Canada and the province to work on Lake Winnipeg. That renewal is due, and I imagine because of COVID, it's been slowed. And we see it's important to have Indigenous people recognized, as signatories, and if that's not possible, to be recognized in that MOU. Well, and I wanted to touch a bit more on what some of the things that Cheyenne was talking about as we talk about reconciliation in Canada. I like to think of it as repairing trust, and part of that is the hard work I've talked about. But we have to also recognize that there is a real deficit on many fronts in that relationship. So that's everything from physical things like infrastructure to funding to ability to organize, and those deficits continue to show their face. And even as you see people make, I think, genuine efforts to sort of repair relationships between First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and provincial, federal governments, I still think that people are surprised that First Nations or Indigenous governments aren't able to always just respond immediately. And when I started thinking of the Canada Water Agency, I can't help but think that maybe it's best spent as an Indigenous-led initiative, that the funds and resources that go towards an agency really could be directed almost entirely by Indigenous people as a way of resolving and reconciling that challenge. And that gets at all kinds of that helps address a lot of issues, and I think it's something worth looking at and worth doing. And I guess further to that point, I also think a lot of what's talked about in the Canada Water Agency right now that would be done by Environment Canada or Agriculture Canada, those are things that those departments can still follow through on, right? So new initiatives to innovate, to collaborate, and to work with what I would like to see is a Canadian or an Indigenous water agency could also continue and be strengthened. And I think, I don't know if I have, yeah, I think I've used most of my time here, but it certainly is, there's a lot to talk about here, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. More important points. Now we'll see if anybody has submitted any questions. Just a minute and I'll see if I've. Okay. We have a question asking if any of you can say what kinds of things were done for Lake Erie to take action and move this debate forward.
I guess I did raise that. I could start with actually to some degree. I've looked in surprise at Lake Erie. There is action taken quite early on by multiple governments, both U.S. and Canadian governments, different states and municipalities, all participated in at various degrees of interest and were motivated to address the problem. They looked at, it was one of the reasons that the experimental lakes area was set up, and they took the evidence that came out of the experimental lakes area and they applied it, and they applied so across that entire watershed to some great success, and were able to reduce algal blooms for coming, because a lot of it was coming out of municipal sewage systems. And I think that there's been a recent increase in phosphorus on the land coming from agricultural sources that has again causing phosphorus blooms or phosphorus related algal blooms. So I think their work continues for sure, but they've been organized since at least the 70s, to my knowledge.
Actually, I'll just jump in here myself, even though I'm not a panelist, because I happen to have tried to find out a lot about what was happening with Lake Erie in my Lake Winnipeg work. And what I understand is that a lot of the larger communities around the lake really spent a lot of money upgrading their sewage treatment. So that helped tremendously. But a few years ago, they had such a terrible algal bloom near, I think it was Toledo, Ohio, that the whole city had to actually be on a boil water advisory or basically not use the water for several days. So I think what I've heard is that they're trying to pay much more attention to agricultural inputs now. But anyway, I know I just couldn't stop myself from saying that because it's an area I've been so interested in. Cheyenne and Richard, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a little bit. I'm not super familiar with the Lake Erie kind of debate over the past few decades, but I know that the Great Lakes in general and the Great Lakes Basin there's a ton of resources and a lot of innovative stuff that's happened around governance of the Great Lakes Basin and efforts to address the ecological challenges. And I think for Lake Winnipeg, that can be, I mean, we should have greater investment and parallel efforts here, but the kind of rallying cry around large lakes and their basins and governing according to a basin perspective, I think can be really effective. And in the Great Lakes, it's even more complex because there's, you have the Great Lakes crossing international boundaries as well as the basin crossing international boundaries. But I think there's a lot of lessons there. And I think just as a thinking about that paradigm shift to basin governance. That's something that we could take some lessons away from for Lake Winnipeg for sure.
Did you have anything, Cheyenne?
No, not on this topic specifically.
Sure. Okay, we'll go to the next question then. Can panelists give us their perspectives on how to address the issue of agriculture wetland drainage, given that wetlands are under provincial jurisdictions? Should this be addressed in the Canada Water Agency? So can we go ahead with, anybody want to answer that?
I'm happy to speak on that. It was part of our the 5 things for sure. It is tricky because of the interjurisdictional nature of wetlands and land management. But one thing that we also know is that the floods and probably droughts, but floods do become a cost that's borne by the federal government. So as we see more wetlands drained, there is less resilience in the land to sort of absorb water and release it slowly over time. And that results in just downstream accumulation, kind of snowballing of water that can lead to really terrible floods, of course, like we saw, well, we've been seeing repeatedly, and I think we'll continue to see more and more of as climate change picks up. And those costs are not insignificant. They're major. The floods themselves are a major part of natural disaster spending, and recovery from natural disasters is largely due to inland floods. So I think it behooves the federal government to work with provinces to make sure that there is a real plan for what happens in the prairies and our wetlands.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And just to add a little bit to that, I mean, I think it's a good question, and the jurisdictional question, not just for wetlands, but for everything the agency does is really important. And the federal government's well aware of this. They're approaching it pretty carefully just because there is a lot of questions around what this means for provincial jurisdiction over water. And there's some concern from some provinces about what it means for their jurisdiction when we're talking about a new federal water agency. So I think the federal government has a strong role to play. It's just a matter of parsing out exactly what that is. I mean, Daniel's talking about the kind of the interjurisdictional nature of wetlands. So there's probably a coordinating role to play there. There's also that data and information collection, promoting best practices, the basin level governance. Like those are all really important components. But just to say that the jurisdictional question is super tricky. And I know it's something that the federal government has their focus on as they think about where the agency is best situated in all of these different challenges.
I have something to add. I think that the provinces should be more involved in the new Canada Water Agency because Indigenous governments themselves should start looking at managing the waters and the wetlands through a co-development process and thinking of it at the watershed level where they can connect with their neighbors and neighboring First Nations and neighboring non-Indigenous communities and sit together at a governing table and discussing what the opportunities are and what the issues are and how, especially wetland drainage, and how they can collaborate and work together to resolve these issues because they're all impacted. You're impacted what your neighbor does down the flowway. It's going to affect you eventually. So you need to be concerned about the health of the wetland and the area. And those are some tools that we have within SEER is to look at that type of planning from a wetland, a watershed level, to how to work together and collaborate. So I definitely think that the Canada Water Agency needs to consider that in terms of when they're gathering with the various jurisdictions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Here's another question. How much input do you think organizations like Flow and SEER would be able to contribute to a Canada Water Agency once it's implemented? If any, actually. So
I'm not sure. It's a good question. We've been I mean, Flow has been trying to assert ourselves as much as possible in the conversation leading up to the development of the agency. And I think and I've talked about this with Glenn from the Eco Network, like there's a bit of a deficit in terms of federal water policy coordination amongst organizations that are interested in that sort of thing. One thing Flow's done leading up to this point of establishing the agency is trying to convene organizations that have an interest in the agency just to do some information sharing and to share perspectives and, if possible, provide a bit of a unified voice to government to help shape what the agency will look like. But as far as engagement once it's established, yeah, I'm not sure if that's going to be kind of status quo government engagement or if it'll be something a bit more innovative.
Okay, thanks. Now, Daniel's idea for the Canadian Water Agency to be an Indigenous-led agency is really intriguing. Could we hear more from him on this proposal and what it would look like, and from Cheyenne as well?
Sure. I'm glad you like it. Yeah, thinking about being Indigenous-led is a challenge. So just one of the things is diversity. Of course, there is a lot of Indigenous peoples, language groups, nations across Canada. We have kind of different legal groups, of course, Inuit and Métis and First Nations. So there's some good examples of work that's proceeding in New Zealand, for instance, but then they work with a relatively together group of Maori who are speaking directly to the New Zealand government, whereas here we have, I actually don't know the full number, but it's over 60 groups of nations that would all want to contribute to water governance across all of Canada, of course. So I guess part of what needs to happen is that setup time, right? So rather than the federal government saying, okay, here's how we're going to structure it and here's what we're going to do, we need those conversations to happen amongst our communities, with our elders, between nations. And I do think that does take some time, but there is, I'm convinced there's ways to bring, a sort of a confederacy approach between multiple nations.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Cheyenne, do you have anything to contribute here?
Yeah, it is really interesting, and I think going off Daniel's point about the diversity, there's also the different nations, right, that are independent from the federal government as well that may want to weigh in on this topic, and is there a place for them, as well as the First Nations that under the First Nation Land Management Act that have a bit more, I guess, autonomy over their lands and waters, because they have the opportunity to build that into their land management code, and they have an opportunity to develop laws, as I was mentioning, that laws that can govern what happens on their lands. So it's very intriguing to see how you can collaborate and bring these groups together. I think that if it does happen that way, that whatever is produced, we need to think about what is the target audience, like what is our targeted outcomes, and who do we ultimately want to reach and benefit from the Canada Water Agency and what is developed. As an example that I provided in my presentation about climate choices is they have research and reports, and there's Indigenous research involved in that. So we need to think about what's the end product. Like, we're talking about an agency and to co-develop and develop the agency, but what's going to be produced from that, and how is it going to benefit the Indigenous governments and Indigenous nations, and especially down to the community level, because so many times there's resources and materials that are developed that the community doesn't get to see. The information is collected, but it doesn't trickle down. It gets sent to the communities at the leadership level. But how do community members and the elders and the knowledge holders absorb that information and in a format that is going to be useful to them? So I think in terms of Indigenous led, I would want to, if we were going to go down that route, then we need to make sure that what the outcomes are going to be used for the long term. And we think not just tomorrow, but we think about the next 7 generations ahead of us. Thank you.
Great points for sure. Okay, here's another one. Richard, you mentioned that the Lake Diefenbaker project. Do you know if the federal government would is going to assess this project, and how would a water agency potentially approach the project?
Yeah, I know there's a lot more intended work to be done to build the foundation, the groundwork for that project. It's a huge $4 billion multi-decade project. But also, oddly enough, the provincial government in Saskatchewan's already given the project the green light and is doing kind of baseline engineering work as the first phase. One of the interesting things about this, and it's pretty egregious, I think, is that the project was announced, that it was going to happen, but also that there was going to be consultation with Indigenous nations who are affected by, and there's going to be massive ecological effects to this project as well, diverting a lot of water away from the South Saskatchewan River. But you can't do consultation once there's already a project approved. Like, that's a backwards process. And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is there's a lot of unanswered questions around the impacts of climate change on the project, how viable it's going to be when water resources change dramatically in the next 20 or 30 years. So as to what the agency could do, I think there's just so many unanswered questions. There's impacts for Indigenous jurisdictions downstream, as well as the province of Manitoba. And I think there needs to be like a basin approach or a watershed approach that can look at the project from an ecological standpoint and from a multi-jurisdictional standpoint and provide an assessment based on that. I think the agency could play a role in bringing those players to the table as well, and playing that convening function to kind of avoid potential disputes and arrive at a solution that is good for all parties involved. But as it stands, it's a really strange kind of single jurisdictional approach to what's a big project that affects a lot of different people and levels of government and Indigenous nations. So I think that convening role is key, and also the information gathering and doing a watershed analysis that goes beyond what's been done already.
Here's a couple of comments from people regarding this question. One is from Candy Betts to all the panelists. Has it undergone an EIA? The Lake Diefenbaker.
I don't think so, but I'm not an expert in that, so I'm not sure. And as for the other question about whether it's co-funded by the Canada Infrastructure Bank, so it is endorsed by the federal government in that sense. Yeah, and I think it's also Western diversification is kind of taking the lead on it as well. And so my understanding is that the government's pretty supportive and pretty on board, but also promising a bit more consultation studies before it happens. I'm not clear as to what this process actually is going to look like, though.
Okay. Okay, here's another question. A Canada Water Agency can't be an all-encompassing answer to our water problems. What is something that you wouldn't want to see in the Canada Water Agency, or that you would be okay with not being present in the agency immediately? Has anybody got any thoughts on that? Well,
I think I can put my neck out on the line there. It's hard because I try and be more of a builder, right? So I want to think of things that are helpful for the agency or for the federal government. I guess one of the places I'm worried about is water quality trading. So I think that's an idea that's I think it's being proposed for the agency by some people. But I worry about that approach that kind of potentially pits watersheds against each other. And while I can see the how similar it is to what we do with air and carbon trading, water is different, right? And I'm concerned that it would lead to a more economic transactional approach to how we address water.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. I know that idea of water trading credits really concerns me as well. Okay.
Sorry, I'll just,
Yeah.
for water quality trading, we should have a separate webinar on that. I think that'd be super interesting because it's a really complex question.
Okay, well, good suggestion.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I like Daniel, I kind of struggle as to what should be ruled out right away from an agency. I guess I can think of a few things that would probably kill an agency right away, which is lack of attention to the jurisdictional questions and getting pushback from provinces and territories on those. But also, if it's like a status quo government approach to Indigenous water rights and jurisdictions, that's going to be a really bad start, and it's not going to bode well for the longevity of the agency either. So getting those questions right, I guess, is kind of a workaround way to answer that question.
Okay. Also, somebody had made a comment that in relation to Lake Erie and other lakes, we actually have started doing some good work around the point source of phosphorus and other nutrient pollution, but the non-point source is going to be very difficult to work on. Cheyenne?
I was just jumping ahead and I looked at the next question about
Okay.
expanding on the last question on what the priorities for the CWA would be in the first 2 to 5 years. And my answer for that is that the Indigenous governments that join the federal government at that governing table will tell you what those priorities are. And that's where the conversation can start.
Okay, that's a great point. Well, I think we're basically coming close to the end. There's one more comment. Someone has said, I think one of the things this new agency should work on would be to assess or determine costs of water-related challenges, of both doing something about them and not doing something about them. So we have overall costs to the provinces and the country. Well, that's an interesting comment for sure, and important. Okay, I think we're just about out of time here. So Richard, Cheyenne, and Daniel, do any of you want to make a final comment?
I just thank Eco Network for hosting this. Vicky, thank you for moderating. Thanks, Daniel, Cheyenne, and to everybody for coming out. And just to reiterate, the federal government is doing a consultation till March 1st. And I think it's important to show them that people care about this and to provide input to make sure it goes in the right direction. So I'd encourage people to participate in that process.
Okay, thanks, Richard.
One thing, if you don't mind, one thing I would add is that it doesn't stop then too, right? So certainly get your comments in, but I think that some pressure to the federal government is always going to be important in making sure water stays an important topic and doesn't get lost in all the other priorities that get thrown at them.
Right, good. Cheyenne, do you have anything final?
Final is that there's a great opportunity here to let your voice be heard, and I hope that you choose to do that.
Okay, terrific. So to conclude, I just want to say thank you so much to Richard, Cheyenne, and Daniel for sharing your perspectives, and also to Calvin So and Emily Halderson, our technical assistants, and thank the Manitoba Eco Network and Flow for organizing this event. And just to remind you that next week, there's the Prairie Freshwater Forum on February 18th, and I think there might be a link to that posted in the chat. And if you had any final outstanding questions that you think of and you want to get answered, please send them to us, and we'll distribute them to the panelists and then send you the answers. So anyway, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. We're really excited that so many people joined, and I hope everybody can stay warm. We need to stay warm in Manitoba, that's for sure. Okay, bye for now.